the guard who refused to be a statue. The bells of Windsor Castle had not yet finished their morning chime when Sergeant Thomas Hale took his position outside the north gate. To the passing tourists he looked like every other royal guard they'd ever photographed. Immovable, expressionless, timeless. But Thomas Hale was not stone. He was 36 years old. A former infantry sergeant. A man who had learned the hard way that danger never announced itself politely. His scarred knuckles rested against the polished stock of his ceremonial rifle. His breath was slow, controlled, measured. 12 years in uniform had taught him one thing above all else. The moment you relax is the moment everything goes wrong. That morning something felt wrong. A pattern that didn't belong. At 8:42 a.m., a dark gray sedan rolled past the gate. Nothing unusual. London traffic never slept. At 8:53 it passed again. Same speed. Same driver. Thomas did not move his head. Royal Guards were trained not to react. But his eyes, trained in places far more dangerous than castle grounds, noticed everything. At 9:01 the sedan slowed. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to observe. The driver wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Both hands clenched the steering wheel. Jaw tight. Too tight. Thomas catalogued the details silently. Third pass. Same vehicle. Same driver. No passengers. That was when instinct whispered something cold into his spine. The schedule no one was supposed to interrupt. Princess Anne was scheduled to depart at 9:25 a.m. A routine engagement. A charity visit to a youth rehabilitation center in Reading. No public crowd. No press pool. Which made Thomas uneasy. Because threats loved routine. Inside the courtyard, engines hummed to life. Security vehicles aligned with precision that bordered on ritual. Through the stone archway, Thomas caught a brief glimpse of the princess herself. Calm. Focused. Dressed in navy blue. She carried herself the way she always did. As if fear was something other people dealt with. When instinct starts to scream. At 9:17 the sedan stopped. It did not park properly. It idled. 30 meters from the gate. Thomas felt his pulse shift, not faster, just sharper. Protocol screamed in his mind. Do not break formation. Do not react without confirmation. The sedan's engine remained on. Then, the driver's door opened. The man stepped out slowly. Tall. Broad shoulders. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. His right hand stayed buried in his coat pocket. That hand did not move. Thomas's training from Helmand Province rose uninvited. Hands tell the truth before faces do. The man began walking, not rushing, not wandering, directly toward the gate. Purposeful. Measured. Wrong. Seconds stretch into eternity. The princess's vehicle rolled forward. 10 meters behind the gate now. Thomas's body remained frozen. But inside, alarms detonated. The man's pace quickened. His shoulders tensed. His hand shifted inside the coat. Thomas had 3 seconds. 3 seconds to decide whether he was about to throw away 12 years of service, or watch something unforgivable happen. The hand came out. Black metal caught the light. Not a phone. Not a camera. A gun. The moment the world changed. Thomas broke position. Gasps ripped through the tourists. His bearskin hat hit the ground as he sprinted forward. Weapon, he roared. The sound echoed against centuries-old stone. The man turned. Shock flashed across his face. Because royal guards weren't supposed to move. They were decorations. Symbols. Not soldiers. Thomas closed the distance in 4 strides. The gun began to rise. Thomas lowered his shoulder and hit the man like a freight train. They crashed onto the pavement. The gun fired. A single deafening crack. Screams erupted. Time fractured. Thomas's hand locked around the attacker's wrist. Bone met bone. Pain flared, but pain was irrelevant. This was not a drill. A fight no one was meant to see. They rolled. The man fought wildly, desperate, furious, untrained. A knee slammed into Thomas's ribs. White heat exploded through his side. He didn't let go. Thomas twisted hard. A joint screamed. The gun clattered free and skidded across the stones. Thomas kicked it away without looking. His forearm pressed into the man's throat. Not crushing. Controlling. Don't move, Thomas growled. Don't breathe wrong. The man's eyes filled with terror. Then sirens of boots. Security officers swarmed. Weapons raised. The attacker was pinned, restrained, disarmed. Princess Anne's vehicle had stopped less than 5 meters away. A silent nod that meant everything. Against protocol, the rear door opened. Princess Anne stepped out. Security protested. She ignored them. Her eyes met Thomas's. There were no words, just a single nod. Small, measured, but heavy with meaning. Then she was gone. The convoy retreating into the castle. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, ribs burning, hands shaking. The street was chaos. Cameras, shouts, police racing in from every direction. But Thomas could only think one thing. I chose right. He didn't yet know what it would cost him. The cost of doing what's right. The street outside Windsor Castle no longer looked like a postcard. Police tape cut across cobblestones that had once welcomed tourists and schoolchildren. Blue lights flashed against ancient stone. Armed officers stood at every corner, their faces tight with focus. And at the center of it all stood Sergeant Thomas Hale. Hands scraped, ribs aching, uniform torn. He had saved a life. But the day was far from over. The man on the ground. The attacker sat on the pavement, wrists bound behind his back, shoulders slumped as if the fight had drained something deeper than strength. Gone was the wild resistance. What remained was something colder. Something broken. Thomas watched from a short distance as detectives surrounded the man. The attacker began mumbling. At first it sounded like nonsense. Then Thomas caught the words. She ruined everything, the man whispered. She never answered, never apologized. A chill crept up Thomas's spine. Detective Inspector Rachel Moore knelt in front of the man, her voice calm, measured. Who ruined everything? The man lifted his head. His eyes were hollow. The princess, he said hoarsely. The accident. My wife. My daughter. Silence rippled outward. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't terrorism. This wasn't ideology. This was grief twisted into obsession. The most unpredictable threat of all. A story that didn't exist. Inspector Moore stood and approached Thomas. Sergeant Hale, she said quietly. He believes Princess Anne was involved in a hit and run. Claims his family died because of her. Thomas frowned. There's no record of that. There isn't, Moore agreed. Not even close. She exhaled slowly. He's been posting online for months. Conspiracy forums. Fake articles. Deepfakes. People feeding his grief until it hardened into rage. Thomas looked back at the man. He didn't look evil. He looked empty. And that frightened Thomas far more. When the cameras turned. By noon the footage was everywhere. Royal Guard breaks formation. Gunshot near Princess Anne. Security breach at Windsor Castle. Every angle replayed the moment Thomas lunged. Slow motion. Zoom. Analyzed. The same commentators who once called the guards ceremonial relics, now argued whether Thomas had gone too far. Some praised him. Others asked dangerous questions. Why wasn't protocol followed? What if he'd been wrong? What if this sets a precedent? Thomas didn't watch. He sat alone in the medical wing, ribs wrapped, knee bandaged. He'd faced gunfire before. This scrutiny felt worse. The summons. At 3:40 p.m. the call came. Colonel Edward Whittaker, commanding officer of the Royal Guard, wanted to see him. Immediately. The walk through the barracks felt heavier than any march Thomas had ever done. Whittaker stood behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back. A man carved from discipline. Hale, he said. You broke position. Yes, sir. You abandoned protocol. Yes, sir. You acted independently. Yes, sir. Whittaker studied him. Do you understand what that means for your career? Thomas swallowed. Yes, sir. He expected anger. Instead, Whittaker sighed. You understand, the colonel continued, that had you been wrong, we'd be having a very different conversation. Thomas met his gaze. But I wasn't. The room went quiet. A line between stone and flesh. Whittaker turned toward the window overlooking the parade grounds. 4 years, he said slowly, people have forgotten what this uniform represents. They see tradition, ceremony, silence. He turned back. They forget the guard was born from war. Thomas said nothing. You crossed a line today, Whittaker said. Yet you also reminded the country why that line exists. The colonel stepped closer. I have officers demanding disciplinary action. Others demanding promotion. Parliament is already asking questions. Thomas exhaled. What happens now, sir? Whittaker looked him square in the eyes. Now, he said, we wait. The princess speaks. That evening something unexpected happened. Princess Anne issued a statement. Brief, direct, uncharacteristically personal. I am alive today because one man trusted his judgment over his comfort. Sergeant Thomas Hale acted with courage, restraint, and selflessness. I owe him my life. The nation paused. Critics went quiet. And Thomas, sitting alone in the barracks, closed his eyes. He hadn't done it for recognition. But hearing those words, they mattered. The man behind the threat. Late that night, Inspector Moore returned. She sat across from Thomas in the infirmary. "He lost his family in a motorway accident 5 years ago," she said softly. "Drunk driver. Not royal. Not protected. Just tragedy." Thomas nodded. "Grief looks for someone to blame," Moore continued. "Online, he found a story that gave his pain a target." She paused. "You stopping him didn't just save the princess. It saved him from becoming something irreversible." Thomas stared at his bandaged hands. He had ended violence. But he hadn't ended suffering. A new storm forms. Outside, journalists camped overnight. Inside Parliament, debates began. Should protocol change? Should guards have more discretion? Had tradition finally met modern threat? And Thomas? He lay awake. Because deep down he knew this story wasn't over. Saving a life was only the beginning. The consequences, for him, for the guard, for the monarchy, were still unfolding. When duty is put on trial, the inquiry began 3 days later. Not in a courtroom, not on television, but inside a quiet, oak-paneled chamber where history had judged men for centuries. And now it would judge Sergeant Thomas Hale. The room that felt heavier than war. Thomas stood alone at the center of the chamber. No rifle, no bearskin hat, no crowd. Just a long table and 6 figures seated behind it. Senior officers, legal advisors, security analysts. Men and women who understood rules. And feared what happened when rules bent. Colonel Whitaker sat at the far end, expression unreadable. The chairwoman of the inquiry spoke first. "Sergeant Hale," she said, "you are here because you acted outside established Royal Guard protocol." "Yes, ma'am." "Your actions prevented harm," she continued. "But they also set a dangerous precedent." Thomas felt his pulse steady. He had faced worse than words. The question that changed everything. A security advisor leaned forward. "Tell us," he said, "why you moved." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Because the threat was real." "That is your opinion." "No," Thomas replied calmly. "That was my assessment." A murmur rippled across the room. The chairwoman raised a hand. "You were trained to observe, not intercept." "I was trained to protect," Thomas said. Silence followed. "Protocol exists," Thomas continued, "to prevent chaos. But protocol also assumes time. I didn't have time." One of the panelists frowned. "What if you were wrong?" Thomas met her gaze. "Then I'd accept the consequences. But if I was right and didn't act, someone else would be dead." The room held its breath. A life reduced to headlines. Outside those walls, Thomas's name was everywhere. Hero guard or reckless risk? Did tradition almost kill a princess? Reporters camped outside the barracks. Strangers debated his worth online. They dissected his past, his military record, his childhood. They didn't know him, but they felt entitled to judge him. Thomas didn't read the articles. He thought of something his father once told him. "If you let the crowd decide who you are, you'll never recognize yourself again." The unexpected witness. Midway through the inquiry, the doors opened. A hush fell instantly. Everyone stood. Princess Anne entered. No entourage. No announcement. Just presence. Thomas stiffened instinctively. She nodded once to the panel, then looked directly at him. "You may sit," she said. Her voice was calm, unyielding. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Your Royal Highness, this inquiry?" "I am aware of its purpose," the princess said. "And I requested to speak." She turned to the panel. "You are debating whether Sergeant Hale broke protocol." She paused. "I am here because he broke protocol." The room went utterly still. A truth no one could ignore. "I've lived my life under protection," the princess continued. "I know the risks. I know the rules. I also know courage when I see it." She glanced at Thomas. He saw a danger others did not. And when the moment came, he chose responsibility over appearance. One advisor shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, ma'am," he said, "rules exist to prevent overreach." "And rules," she replied, "are written by people who cannot foresee every moment." She leaned forward slightly. If Sergeant Hale had remained still, if he had chosen obedience over action, we would not be having this discussion. No one argued, because there was nothing to argue. The question of consequence. The chairwoman spoke carefully. "Your Highness, are you suggesting protocol should be changed?" The princess considered this. I am suggesting, she said, that protocol should remember it serves people, not the other way around. She turned toward Thomas. Sergeant, do you regret your decision? Thomas swallowed. No, ma'am. Even knowing what it might cost you? No, ma'am. The princess smiled faintly. That, she said, is why you wear that uniform. The longest wait. The inquiry recessed. Hours passed. Thomas sat alone in a side room, staring at the floor. For the first time since the incident, doubt crept in. Had he gone too far? Had he forced change where none was wanted? Then Colonel Whitaker entered. He closed the door quietly. They're divided, the colonel said. Half want to discipline you. Half want to rewrite the book. Thomas nodded. What do you think, sir? Whitaker studied him. I think, he said, that history rarely favors those who stand still. A decision that echoed beyond one man. At dusk, the panel reconvened. Thomas stood. The chairwoman spoke. Sergeant Thomas Hale, this inquiry finds that your actions, while outside written protocol, were justified under exceptional threat assessment. His chest tightened. Effective immediately, she continued, the Royal Guard will undergo a review of engagement discretion in active threat scenarios. Pause. As for you, no disciplinary action will be taken. Thomas exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. But the chairwoman wasn't finished. You will, however, assist in rewriting the very protocols you broke. A ripple of surprise spread. You saw what others did not, she said. Now help us ensure no one has to choose between duty and conscience again. The weight of change. Later that night, Thomas stood alone near the gate where it had all begun. The stones were clean now. No blood. No tape. Tourists laughed. Cameras clicked. And Thomas returned to his post. Still, watchful. But the world no longer saw him as a statue. And neither did he. Because some moments don't just change history. They change the people trusted to guard it. The quiet moments that define a legacy. The gates of Windsor Castle looked the same as they always had. Ancient. Unyielding. Unmoved by human drama. But Sergeant Thomas Hale knew better now. Because places remembered what people tried to forget. Back where it all began. Thomas resumed duty at the North Gate 3 days after the inquiry concluded. Same position. Same uniform. Same silence. Tourists still whispered. Still pointed. But now when they looked at him they didn't see a statue. They saw a man who had moved. Thomas kept his eyes forward. He didn't want admiration. He wanted normalcy. But normal had already passed him by. The message no one expected. At 10:12 a.m., a junior officer approached him discreetly. Sergeant, he whispered, you've been requested inside. Thomas didn't react outwardly. Inside his chest tightened. He followed the corridor through the inner grounds, past stone walls few ever walked beyond. The room he entered was small. Unadorned. Quiet. Princess and stood by the window. Alone. No cameras. No titles. She turned as he entered. Sergeant Hale, she said. Thomas snapped to attention. Ma'am? She raised a hand gently. At ease. This isn't official. That alone felt heavier than any ceremony. I wanted to thank you, she said. You already did, ma'am. She shook her head. That was public. This is personal. She studied him, not as a symbol, not as a guard, but as a man. You didn't hesitate, she said. You didn't ask permission. You didn't look for reassurance. Thomas swallowed. I did my duty. No, she replied softly. You did what was right. The weight of survival. She turned back to the window. People assume surviving something like that feels triumphant, she continued. It doesn't. It feels borrowed. Thomas understood. In war, survival carried its own burden. There's something else, she said quietly. The man who attacked me. Thomas stiffened. He's alive, she said. He's receiving help. She turned back. And he asked about you. Thomas blinked. He wanted to know, she continued, why you didn't strike him after you disarmed him. Thomas thought back to the man's terrified eyes. I didn't need to, he said. The threat was over. The princess nodded. That answer, she said, matters? Facing the aftermath. Later that day, Thomas sat across a thick glass partition at a secure medical facility. The attacker sat opposite him. No rage now. Just exhaustion. I thought you'd hate me, the man said hoarsely. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Hate takes energy, Thomas replied. I used mine stopping you. The man flinched. I was wrong, he whispered. I let people convince me of something that wasn't true. Thomas leaned forward slightly. You lost your family, he said. That pain is real. But what you believed after, that wasn't. Tears filled the man's eyes. You saved her, he said. And you saved me from becoming a murderer. Thomas stood. I didn't save you, he said. You stopped. And sometimes that was enough. The story finally told right. That night a new broadcast aired. Not speculation. Not outrage. Truth. The full investigation. The false narratives that fueled the attack. The online echo chambers that turned grief into violence. And Thomas's words from the inquiry echoed across the nation. Protocol exists to protect people. But when protocol forgets the person in front of you, it must be challenged. Public opinion shifted. Quietly. Permanently. The uniform reimagined. Weeks later, new training modules were introduced. Royal Guards were no longer trained only to observe. They were trained to assess, to trust judgment, to act when necessary. Thomas became an instructor. Not because he wanted authority, but because he understood responsibility. A moment without applause. One evening, long after the media moved on, Thomas stood at his post as the sun dipped behind the castle walls. A child tugged her mother's sleeve. Why does he stand so still? She asked. The mother smiled. So he's ready if someone needs him. Thomas heard that. And for the first time he smiled too. Because legacy isn't built in headlines. It's built in the quiet assurance that if the moment comes, someone will move. The choice that outlives the moment. The medal ceremony was small. No grand parade. No roaring crowds. Just a quiet courtyard inside Windsor Castle, early in the morning before the cameras arrived. That was deliberate. Because some honors meant more when they weren't turned into spectacle. A recognition without applause. Sergeant Thomas Hale stood in formation, still, precise, composed. But this time he was not guarding history. He was standing inside it. A handful of senior officials gathered. A few members of the royal household. And Princess Anne. She stepped forward carrying a small velvet box. This commendation, she said calmly, is awarded not for obedience but for judgment. She opened the box. Inside lay a medal rarely given. For exceptional courage under immediate threat. She pinned it to Thomas's uniform herself. Her voice lowered. You didn't just protect me, she said. You protected what this institution stands for. Thomas met her gaze. I'd do it again, he said quietly. She smiled. I know. The world moves on, but some things don't. Within weeks the headlines faded. Another story replaced his. Another outrage. Another distraction. But something had changed beneath the surface. Royal Guard training manuals were revised. Threat assessment autonomy was formalized. Instinct was no longer treated as disobedience. Young guards began asking different questions. What would I do if the moment came? Would I freeze, or move? And Thomas made sure they understood one thing. Courage isn't loud, he told them. It doesn't announce itself. It whispers, and you decide whether to listen. The man he nearly lost. Months later, Thomas received a letter. Handwritten. Careful. From the man who had once raised a weapon. He had entered long-term treatment. He had cut himself off from the forums that fed his anger. He was learning, slowly, how to grieve without destroying. One line stayed with Thomas. You saw me when I had forgotten how to see myself. Thomas folded the letter and placed it in his locker. Not as a reminder of danger, but of restraint. One last test. On an ordinary afternoon long after the incident, Thomas noticed something again. A man lingering too long. Eyes scanning. Posture tense. This time the man was harmless. Just nervous. Just lost. Thomas didn't move. He watched. And when the man finally approached, confused and overwhelmed, Thomas spoke calmly, directed him safely away and returned to stillness. Because wisdom wasn't only knowing when to act. It was knowing when not to. What the world never saw. Years later, tourists still posed for photos. Children still laughed. Cameras still clicked. Most would never know the difference between a statue and a guardian. And that was exactly how Thomas wanted it. Because the truest form of protection is invisible. The lesson that endures. On the day Thomas retired, a young guard took his place at the gate. Nervous, focused, proud. Thomas adjusted the young man's uniform and said only this. Stand still, but never be empty. The young guard nodded, not fully understanding. Not yet. The final truth. History would record the incident as a security breach prevented. News would summarize it in seconds. But the real story was quieter. A man trusted his instinct. Chose responsibility over comfort. and reminded the world that tradition survives not by rigidity, but by courage. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is move. End arrow. End of story.